So Andrea, thanks for being with us. What do we need to know about interpretation?
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrea with the Community Language Cooperative, and I'm here because you guys are committed to practice language justice in this space where people can hear and speak in the language of their heart. So we're going to have simultaneous interpretation in English and in Spanish. And once I'm done saying this message in Spanish, we're going to turn on the interpretation, and you're going to see a globe that is going to come up at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on your phone or tablet, you're going to see three little dots or where it says more. You're going to click there and you're going to select your preferred language. If you are bilingual in English and in Spanish, you don't have to select one and you can always speak in whichever of those two you feel more comfortable. Just remember to speak at a conversational pace, especially our panelists. Spanish is 25% longer than English. It will take me longer to repeat everything in the other language. Stretch your words. Remain muted when you're not speaking and speak close to your microphone when it's your turn to speak. And if there's any questions, you can ask it in the chat. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Andrea, estoy aquí con la Community Language Cooperative y vamos a practicar la justicia del lenguaje en este espacio donde podamos hablar y escuchar en el idioma de nuestro corazón. Tendremos interpretación simultánea en inglés y en español y cuando aprendamos la interpretación van a ver un globo que va a aparecer en la parte inferior de su pantalla o si están en su teléfono o tableta van a ver tres punticos donde dice más y ahí van a poder seleccionar su idioma. Recuerden hablar un paso conversacional, mantenerse en silencio cuando no estén hablando y hablar muy cerquita a su micrófono cuando sea su turno de hablar. And this includes everybody in the panel. You will also need to choose your preferred language. And we can begin interpretation now.
Thanks so much, Andrea. You guys do a great job. We love working with CLC. All right, so let's get started. Welcome to our webinar on the intersection of housing and climate. I'm so pleased to have Colorado Governor Jared Polis with us here today to kick off our webinar. We're going to have some conversation with the governor, and then he'll leave us and get on with his busy day. And then we'll hear from our panelist, Jonathan Cappelli from the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, Matt Fromer from Southwest Energy Efficiency Project SWEEP, and Adams County Commissioner Eva Henry. So when we get into the panelists, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think we all know how to do that these days, and we'll have a chance to pose some of those questions to our panelists. But let's get going with the governor. So as we look to the 2024 legislative session and think about how some of the most important issues right now, of course, climate and housing are top of mind for us as an organization, and I know for Governor Polis and a lot of voters out there. Governor, I say often at the beginning of the last legislative session, you said that climate policy is housing policy and housing policy is climate policy. And I could not agree more. I think that was a real clear statement of your leadership and intent. And when you combine it with your commitment to reach 100% renewable energy by 2040, I think it's a powerful combination for your strong leadership on these really important issues. And we're really appreciative that you have spoken so clearly and stepped out on these issues. So tell us a little bit about your perspective on this. Why is it imperative that we work on housing and climate together?
Thank you, Kelly. And Conservation Colorado, thank you for convening this. Conservation Colorado has been a key partner in making progress towards the strong sustainability goals we have. And of course, to achieve our climate goals, we need to look at how we live, our housing policy, how far people live from jobs. Obviously, Coloradans care deeply about affordability. Affordability, sustainability, livability is really what this discussion is all about. And we've had so many conversations across the state, and every single one of them, housing has really come to the top, especially with the increase in interest rates nationally. People are more concerned than ever around costs. And to recognize our goals around how people live, saving people on transit, the average Coloradan spends about $1,800 a year commuting, on housing costs, on water sustainability, on climate. These are all tied together. So of course it's about climate, but also about water efficiency. It's about fire risk. It's about traffic and air quality. It's about so many aspects of how we can continue to improve our quality of life as Coloradans. Building smart, energy efficient housing near transit, especially around expanded and accessible transit. Another key part of what we need to do in our state and in our metropolitan regions will help us meet the very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals by reducing traffic as well as energy use. Enabling people to live in the communities they love. Who wouldn't want, if they could afford it, a 5-minute commute instead of a 40-minute commute? Being able to live and access culturally rich destinations without having to get in a car or park. Creating thriving communities where people can have their needs met, walking, biking, bus, front range rail. This also helps protect our open space, help protect our agricultural lands, our air and water. It's inherently more water efficient, and less traffic on the roads means cleaner air, as well as protecting our majestic wildlife from the dangers of unchecked sprawl. Being thoughtful about how we do this, our planning, will help make sure we consider climate hazards first and foremost, like wildfire and flooding and extreme heat. These are all at higher risk because of climate change. And of course, investing in and improving multimodal transit options to help decrease commute times and costs. That's why I'm so excited about the opportunity to call for front range passenger rail, Pueblo to Fort Collins, mountain rail. These can really be a backbone for transit along the Front Range in Western Colorado, empowering and enabling transit plan communities. For a transit plan community to thrive, it needs strong transit. And for transit to have the economy of scale it needs to reduce costs, it needs to have customer base and people who are able to live near that transit and to be able to take advantage of it. The bottom line is now I'm quoting Kelly, quoting me, housing policy is climate policy, and climate policy is housing policy. And if we are sincere about achieving our climate goals, we need to work towards our housing and transit goals to unlock the kind of future that we deserve in our great state, with a thriving economy, with vibrant urban, suburban, rural communities, cleaner air, fresh water to drink, accessible parks, and world-class open space. And a future where fundamentally Coloradans can afford to live where they want to live, closer to job centers, with less traffic, shorter commutes, convenient access to low-cost transit. That's really what this discussion is all about and why it's so important for who our state is now, who we're going to be on our 150th anniversary in 3 years, and what kind of state we want to have for ourselves, our kids, and our grandkids. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Governor. Really great to hear you putting transit and rail so central to this. I know that's been a really important part of your vision, certainly a priority for us. And I want to talk and just hear from you a little bit how you think about the transportation sector. It's such a hard sector to decarbonize. It's such an important piece of our climate puzzle. Why do you think it's been so hard to decarbonize? And how do you think these policies that you're working on for this upcoming session will help us clean this sector up and give people better, healthier, cleaner options?
Well, it's very exciting how electric vehicles are taking off, and we joined with Conservation Colorado on passing historic tax credits around electric vehicles, helping school districts convert to electric buses. But we also all know while that percentage of new vehicles sold that are electric will continue to increase, and I think we're already over 13%. Many people drive cars for 10 or 15 years. So even if you're at a point in 10 years where the majority of vehicles sold are electric, you'll still have, it won't necessarily be a majority of vehicles on the streets because that simply takes time. Just as we're working with school districts to replace existing diesel buses with electric buses, if they bought a diesel bus 2 or 3 years ago, they're probably going to continue to use that for the life of the bus, then ultimately replace it with electric. So this discussion about reducing transit is incredibly important. I would also add that even electric vehicles, of course, have a footprint. We're not yet at 100% clean energy. We're going to be at 80% by 2029, but that means even electric vehicles in 2029, about 20% of their energy will be non-renewable. So it's a very important discussion about how we can reduce commute times, allow people to affordably live closer to where they work. That's really a triple win scenario. It's a win for climate. It's a win for an individual because that extra time you can spend at home or at your kid's soccer game is priceless. And it's a win for air quality, independently from directly related to climate issues. It means more breathable air in Colorado. So really looking at all fronts on how we can make sure people have more ways to get where they want to go in a more energy efficient fashion. Electric vehicles, buses, passenger rail, biking, and pedestrian.
Oops, just getting my mute button there. Thanks, Governor. I think that making that connection between how far electric vehicles can get us and then the other pieces we need to do to clean up our transportation sector is really key. And giving people those options that are more affordable, such an important part of it. I want to go back to when you first opened up and started talking about this. You tucked in there some things about wildlife, our lands. Coloradans love their public lands, their open spaces, and water conservation. And I'm not sure we always make the connection between our housing and land use policy and how it impacts things like open space and wildlife and water conservation. Can you talk just a little bit more about that? Because I know that's a huge priority for you.
This is very important. The kind of alternative to this vision that we're talking about here today is further and further exurban sprawl as people have to live even further from job centers in a less water efficient manner, larger plots, less energy efficient, and longer commute times to get to work. This alternative that we're talking about here today gives people the opportunity to live closer to a job center in housing that is more energy efficient and water efficient. So our population, our cities, our suburbs already use about over 20% of our water in our state. That's one of the fastest growing segments. If we don't want to dry up agriculture in Colorado, we need to make sure that, and demographers say we're going to be at 8 million people by 2050. We need to do that in a way that doesn't just linearly advance water usage. We have to be more efficient about the water we use in the urban and suburban interface. This includes the plan to do it. Protecting open space for wildlife, for wild areas, again, under a lot of pressures for development because nobody can afford to live closer to where they want to live, which is near where their jobs are. So again, the alternative expanding into the wildland urban interface, which is also increases fire risk and flood risk, but also decreases habitat for the many species that also call Colorado home.
Well, thanks, Governor. I know we just have another minute with you. Anything you wish we'd asked that you didn't get to cover that you want to just leave us with some parting words?
I'd say this discussion is about affordability in housing, in transit, and how you get where you want to go. It's about sustainability as a state, which means climate, air quality, water efficiency. And it's about livability, which means, who wouldn't love to have that time back that you have to spend in a commute or reduce your commute, live affordably close to job centers and cultural centers, be able to not have to worry about parking if you are enjoying cultural aspects in any of our major cities. These are major advantages in livability, cost reductions, and improvements in climate, air quality, and water efficiency. And there's great synergy and alignment between those goals. And that's why we put this roadmap to Colorado's future last week. And we even want to go above and beyond that, working with the environmental community, housing advocates, the business community, and a broad coalition to deliver on this promise of what Colorado can be. We can be more affordable, more livable, and more sustainable. And I look forward to the discussions today about how we're going to get there. Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, Governor. Really, really appreciate you taking the time with us. We had a great set of folks on the webinar. I know they love to hear from you. We will let you go forth and get on with your day. And thanks again. All right, we're going to switch gears now to our panelists. We have such a great group of really key allies for Conservation Colorado. These are the experts that we work closely with, that we look to on this issue, and we're so glad they can be with us today. I think we're going to hear first from Jonathan Cappelli, the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Development Corporation. And then we'll hear from Matt Fromer at SWEEP, and then Commissioner Henry last, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So Jonathan, if you are ready, there you are. Great to see your smiling face with us today. Thanks for being such a terrific partner on this issue. I will turn it over to you and turn off my camera so people can focus on you.
Thanks a lot, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Sean Cappelli, and yes, my organization's the Neighborhood Development Collaborative. It's a coalition of about 21 different affordable housing organizations working across Metro Denver and the state. Have provided about 60,000 homes or housing programs for families in the state. Really honored to be part of this panel. Thank you, Kelly and Conservation Colorado, and also Governor Polis for bringing attention to this issue. So, it's pretty clear that there's an affordable housing issue in Colorado. I mean, there was a survey, I believe, last year that showed about 85% of folks in Colorado cited affordability as an extremely important issue, or one of the most important issues facing the state. We're right now the 8th most expensive state in the country, the 5th most expensive metro area in and around Metro Denver. Denver is the 2nd most gentrified city in the country, and about half of Colorado renters spend more than a third of their income on housing. So the affordability issues sort of facing the state affect everyone, but they skew to impact those with the lowest incomes the most. For every 100 individuals making 80% of the median income, so it's about $70,000, there's about 90 available homes. So not enough. But for every 100 individuals earning 30% of the median income, there's only 29 available homes. And there's just hundreds of thousands more units needed to sort of match the growth that we're getting in this state, that need to be skewed affordable in order to sort of meet people where they're at. So, we don't really have sufficient resources, despite a lot of really positive strides at the state in recent years with different funds that have come online. We still have a dearth of funding and resources to produce affordable homes. But it's not just, producing them, but sort of where they get produced. If they're located near where people work, where they play, and where they go to school. The whole division between housing and jobs and transportation that historically has sort of characterized development patterns in the state have stretched our communities to the point where we're reaching, as you guys are all aware, coastal sort of traffic levels and housing costs. And as the governor mentioned, the erosion of natural land to sprawl, as well as rampant displacement of low-income and BIPOC communities. So probably didn't need to state all that. Most people know that we're having an affordability issue, but wanted to sort of root us in those numbers. The connection to climate change might be a little less clear to some folks, although I think the governor did a great job of laying it out. Here's 3 ways that I think about how they are connected. One is sort of just in a correlation between the cause of the affordability crisis and the cause of our climate crisis, where it intersects at land use. The other is the correlation, or is the disproportionate impact of climate change on low-income households. And then the solution for both issues is sort of number 3, where they actually are pretty connected. So starting with coalition, or correlation between the two, the conditions that lead to the sort of drive till you qualify approach to homeownership, which is sort of the whole country, but particularly Colorado these days, and also increasingly the drive to wherever rent is no longer 50% of your income and you can barely afford it, like model of rental housing. Both those things, or those pressures, leave low-income households and the environment to bear the externalities of a really inefficient and inequitable land use pattern. The lack of dense housing near transit is linked to the lack of affordable housing, which is then linked to sustainable land use patterns. And I'm sure Matt and others will get more into that. When you look at what the impacts of these policies are, it's disproportionately impacts both the affordability sector and just affordability in general, and also lower income Coloradans. All of the major sort of indicators of climate change: too much water, too little water, fire, heat, and pollution, all have disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable populations in our state. Many folks might remember the flooding, right? That's what happened in 2013 and in around Boulder County. You had about 1,900 structures destroyed, a third of all the homes destroyed, and a sixth of all the ones damaged were manufactured homes. as many folks may know that as mobile homes, but we call them manufactured homes now because they're not really mobile. And that sector is sort of the last bastion of unsubsidized affordable housing that we have in the state. And they're particularly vulnerable to flooding. They tend to exist in really in floodplains that are particularly vulnerable to flooding. And this is going to get worse and worse as our 1,000-year floods become, our 100-year floods, and our 100-year floods start happening multiple times within a lifetime. It's just, something that's going to be increasingly impact those homes, both low-income homes or households where neighborhoods that are in the floodplain, whether they're manufactured homes or not. And actually, as we speak, the federal flood risk management standard is being updated to broaden the floodplains to sort of include areas that formerly weren't in the 500 or 1,000-year floodplains in those areas, because we're seeing increased risk. And according to a study by Redfin, formerly redline communities across the country are about 25% more likely to face elevated flood risks than non-redline communities. To give you an example. The other way that this will affect Colorado is through droughts. So extreme weather events that cause sort of rising temperatures, which result in increased evaporation, fueling storms. On the whole, that also means that we're getting hotter each year and then therefore drier. This issue is kind of personal to me, actually, because I grew up in rural Colorado, outside of Rifle. And in the early sort of 2000s, our wells actually ran dry. And so my dad had to go to town, fill up a tank of water, drive it up to a little hill just above the house. And then we had a garden hose that piped from that tank into the house. And we weren't the only one of my neighbors that had our wells run dry. As water gets more and more scarce, it's really going to impact the ability for communities to serve the folks that are living there now and build the affordable housing they need to meet local demand. Buena Vista is an interesting example of this, where they're in the middle of a housing needs assessment they were doing a few years ago. They realized they were going to run out of water taps for the housing that they needed. And they've actually created really interesting policy prioritizing workforce and affordable housing in the new water taps. But generally speaking, they were looking at running out of water by 2030. Drought leads to fire. Everyone's familiar with Grizzly Creek fire, Marshall fire. Marshall fire burned over 1,000 homes down. East Troublesome fire, I think it was 600 homes, and then nearly burnt down Estes Park. Elevated fire risk means that homes are going to be harder and more expensive to insure. And as fires become something that doesn't just happen in the woods and in the country and spill down into our towns and cities on a more and more frequent basis or rate, we're going to have this outsized impact on lower income households who are least likely to be able to afford sort of starting over again when they lose their homes, and just in general shrink the supply of housing at a time when it's crazy to do that. There's also temperature related inequities, folks in older substandard housing that are less likely to be able to have efficient heating and cooling systems, and are impacted that way. And then finally, pollution. So where low-income communities are currently located, housing tends to be cheaper. And so, or rather, where cheaper housing is located, that tends to be in areas that are more exposed to pollutants. A recent study done by UC Berkeley showed that low-income Coloradans are exposed to pollutants at a rate that's just significantly higher. So it's for diesel pollution, 1.5 times or twice as likely to be inhaling diesel pollution, and then 1.5 times more likely to live near a Superfund site. So particulate matter associated with production and burning of fossil fuels really have this disproportionate impact. You kind of think of every home running on non-clean energy almost as like a car idling just year round. None of this is really an urban versus rural issue. It's different risks in different areas, but the Colorado Health Initiative sort of pinned the Western Slope as one of the most environmentally vulnerable areas in the state for heat, fire, drought, and flood, for everything. So when you think about the solutions to all this, you know, it starts with creating enough housing to meet the needs. You know, right now it's almost like we're playing a game of musical chairs, where if you don't find that chair, your house, there's only half as many chairs as there are people, and if you don't get that chair, you have a significant risk of being homeless. You know, first-time homelessness increased by double over COVID. So this is just, we need to increase the supply of affordable housing as soon as possible. Part of the solution, or part of the way to get there, is to do it in a strategic fashion, like I was saying before. Rocky Mountain Institute had a study that showed that just by increasing upzoning and doing infilling around transit corridors could decrease car travel, so that provides housing, decreases car travel by 13%, and all without adding a bus or a train. So long as all these units that we are producing and creating near transit corridors for environmental reasons are affordable and don't displace existing lower-income communities who are there, that combination of strategies is kind of the key to addressing both issues. So in short, low-income Coloradans in some ways have most to lose from unbridled climate change and inefficient land use patterns. If the state implements equitable and efficient land use strategies, low-income households and the conundrum of creating enough housing affordability, that issue maybe has the most to gain from the solutions. So that's what I'd say, and that's it.
Thanks, Jonathan. It is obvious from even hearing from you for a few minutes what a tremendous resource you are in this conversation, and the expertise you bring to this, and the really important voice for the housing community. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for being such a huge part of the coalition, and for all your work on this issue. I'm going to turn next to Matt Fromer with SWEEP, the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, another critical ally in this work and another very smart expert in this area. He's particularly going to focus on transportation. So, and I think Matt might have some slides for us today.
I do, yeah.
Oh, look at that. Tech working as it should. Take it away, Matt.
Excellent. All right. So my name is Matt Fromer. I work on climate, transportation, and land use for the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, or SWEEP. I primarily work on transportation policy, but if you work on transportation long enough, it eventually leads back to land use and housing, because how we choose to build our communities and where we choose to locate the housing, the jobs, and other services ultimately creates that foundation for our transportation system and our transportation needs. So that's what sort of led me into this work. Today, I'm going to talk about the climate benefits of compact development and a few of the policies that we're exploring in Colorado at the local level, at the state level, both to cut emissions and to solve the housing affordability crisis, which, as you just heard, are inextricably linked. A few of the themes I'll be focusing on would be transportation, building energy efficiency, water use, land conservation, and through it all, the equity benefits for low-income communities. Go to the next slide. First, I just want to zoom out and just touch on climate policy at a high level. These last 8 years have been the warmest 8 years on record. And so far, we've warmed the planet by about 1.1 degrees Celsius, when the Paris Climate Agreement says we need to limit total warming to about 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the most damaging impacts of climate change, which in Colorado, that means increased risk of wildfires, drought, and also decreased agricultural yields. So we need to stop the pollution that's threatening our health and overheating the planet. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in Colorado. It also has the largest deficit in meeting our sector-specific climate targets. I do need to give credit to the Polis administration for taking bold action on climate. For example, we live in one of the best states in the country to buy or lease an electric vehicle, but transportation pollution is really stubborn. And we still have a long way to go to meet the 2025 and 2030 statutory targets in our state. And you can see the gap between the targets for 2025 and 2030 there versus the projected emissions under the current policy scenario. Next slide. So how do we cut pollution from transportation? These are kind of the big four buckets I like to talk about. First, we need to electrify all the cars, trucks, and buses on the road and fuel them with clean, renewable electricity. Second, building out a connected multimodal transportation system to enable better access to walking, biking, and public transit. Third one is to develop smart land use policies that build housing in walkable neighborhoods, closer to jobs, transit, and other services. And then the fourth piece here is just less funding for highway expansions and interchanges that we know increase overall driving and pollution. I'm going to focus on the third one here, developing smart land use policies. But I did want to just mention this this quote from RMI. They did some modeling on climate nationwide and found that on the transportation side, the US needs about 70 million electric vehicles and to reduce household driving by about 20% in order to keep us safe from the worst impacts of climate change. So that's a 20% decrease in average household driving. In the Denver region, each of us drives about 25 miles per day on average. 20% decrease would be about 20 miles, just for context there. Next slide. All right, getting into some fun maps here. On the left there, this is from a New York Times model last year, where they looked at sort of the neighborhood level greenhouse gas emissions by household. So dark orange here means higher greenhouse gas emissions per household in those neighborhoods. That's dark orange. Dark green means lower greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, and this is true for every city in the US, this on the left here is the Denver metro area, but it's true for every city. The more urban areas with higher population and job density have lower emissions per household than we see around the urban fringe, which I think is intuitive for most people. In Colorado, we expect to grow by about 1.7 million people by 2050. And the green areas on the left are where we should be trying to focus that growth to minimize the environmental impacts. Yet on the right side, these are a few different growth scenarios from our Denver Regional Council of Governments. You can see the baseline sort of business as usual scenario there in the gray. We're sort of spreading that growth throughout the region versus sort of the more efficient, compact growth scenarios as you get further to the right in the infill and centers scenarios. And we need to develop policies that really promote the more sustainable, compact development you see there. I know growth is a tricky subject. But denying these housing opportunities in our urban areas does not make the housing demand disappear. It only relocates it to the less efficient and less sustainable areas on the urban fringe, much like squeezing a balloon. So to me, it's less of a question about whether we grow and more about how we grow in a way that lowers housing costs and the environmental impacts. Next slide. I like to use this cartoon on the left here just to demonstrate the efficiency of more compact development. So we're comparing a cluster development type on the top there to a sprawling development type on the bottom. On the top, you can see we've got sort of medium to high density population and jobs, where you have services and jobs in closer proximity. That means fewer driving miles if you still choose to drive, but it also enables non-automobile modes like walking, biking, and transit. And you can see on the right there, so sort of average daily vehicle miles traveled for different neighborhood types. You can see sort of 20 to 50% reduction when we have more urban transit-oriented development versus the more single-family sprawling development types. Next slide. And then to help visualize this, I just picked one example from the Denver metro area. This is the Belmar project in Lakewood, where we've got a density of about 31 homes and 35 jobs per acre. I just want to point out, this is not like skyscrapers in Manhattan. You can get enough density from sort of 3 to 5 story buildings with a mix of uses. You might have some ground floor retail, some office buildings, some sort of residential above, some affordable housing, and that nice mix that creates the walkability. And that's reflected in the walk score, transit score, and bike score on the top right there. This is what's known as a walker's paradise and a biker's paradise. I should also say, and Governor Polis mentioned this, that there is a large amount of pent-up demand for walkable neighborhoods. There's a reason that Zillow came up with the walk score, and that's because each point of walk score is associated with about a $3,000 increase in home value. So people want to live in these communities We're just not building enough housing in them. So next slide. When we talk about transit, I think one finding in the research is that you need sort of a minimum density of about 15 homes per acre, or a mix of sort of 15 homes and 25 to 30 jobs per acre to make transit work, to basically have enough ridership to make it cost effective. I just took some sort of aerial screenshots from Google Earth here of a few rail stations around the Denver Metro, and you can see on the top line there, not a home in sight around some of these rail stations. Very low density. In fact, we have about 80 rail stations in the region, and I think only 6 of the 80 meet that sort of minimum transit supportive density threshold that would generate significant ridership. This is not a huge criticism because most of our system is very new and built in the last 10 to 20 years. So still plenty of opportunity for it to mature and to bring the people to the transit system, but we need the policies in order to do that. On the bottom here, Sweep actually did a parking count at some of our the park and ride stations around rail. RTD is the largest owner of parking spaces in the state. 80 park and rides, 30,000 spaces. Only about 20% of those 30,000 spaces are used during peak periods. So plenty of opportunity to build mixed-use communities, affordable housing around our rail system. Next slide. I wanted to mention quickly that reducing household driving not only cuts carbon emissions, but also saves people money. And CDOT actually did a study a couple of years ago showing that a 10% reduction in household driving would save Coloradans about $40 billion by 2050, mostly in the form of less spending on vehicle operating costs. So fuel, maintenance, repairs, insurance, less spending on traffic fatalities in society, less time spent lost in traffic, and then save costs on medical expenses from cleaner air and more physical activity. So huge benefits there. And even if we didn't have a climate problem, it would be good policy to focus on strategies that reduce total driving. Next slide. And then when we think about some of the most expensive cities in the country, I think for a lot of us, our minds jump to the coasts, New York City and San Francisco, where housing is really expensive. However, when we look at the combined housing and transportation costs as a share of income, Denver is actually more expensive than New York, Seattle, and San Francisco because we tend to spend a lot of money on transportation as a share of income, up for around 19 to 20% of income. Next slide. So I also want to touch on sort of the building energy efficiency benefits of compact development. I think we've made some great progress recently on things like energy efficient building codes. We should also acknowledge, though, that attached housing types and multifamily housing types are inherently more efficient and more sustainable than detached and larger single family homes. And you can see that borne out in the data here. Attached and multifamily housing types are just less expensive and energy intensive in terms of heating and cooling. Next slide. It's a very similar story on water consumption. And here's a look at sort of single family homes versus attached and multifamily housing types. A lot of water is used for, of course, outdoor irrigation and single family homes. And we can stand to conserve quite a bit of water just by allowing and encouraging more water-wise land use in those housing types. Next slide. I do want to touch on sprawl and plan development. Here's just one plan development, and it's kind of small, but on the left there is a snapshot from Google Earth with the airport DIA at the top of the screen. This is the Northeast Aurora area plan for 78,000 new homes. It's pretty low density, about 4 homes per acre, which is really less than a third of what you'd need for frequent transit. So we need to think up and explore strategies to make this sort of plan development more efficient, more compact, more mixed use, because the status quo is only going to lead to more driving, more pollution, and land use. Next slide. Jonathan Cappelli mentioned the RMI study. I just wanted to highlight it here and encourage people to go read it. There's a blog about it. Basically looked at the baseline land use scenarios versus a sort of smart growth strategy where we focus on urban centers and found significant reductions in household driving, greenhouse gas emissions, building energy use, and land consumption. Next slide. And I'm running out of time here, but I just wanted to mention some of the policies we're looking at in the state to really encourage that smart growth and discourage the more car-dependent, low-density sprawl around the urban fringe. Just to mention a few things like transit-oriented development, so legalizing mixed-use density and multifamily housing near transit, especially affordable housing, housing needs planning, which Jonathan Cappelli mentioned, small lot zoning reform, which includes things like accessory dwelling units, multiplexes, and smaller lot sizes for single-family homes, right-sizing parking, so that we're not having these costly and arbitrary local parking mandates, and we're sort of allowing businesses and builders to right-size their parking based on local context, streamlining the permitting and approval processes, smart growth, so aligning state and regional funding with compact development, and then lastly, removing occupancy limits and just allowing people to live in the bedrooms that we've already built. Next slide. Okay, that's all I've got. I'm gonna hand it back to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Matt. That is a terrific slideshow. I feel like I could just carry that around in my back pocket for the whole session. All right, and our last panelist, last but not least, is Commissioner Eva Henry. We're so glad to have her on board, long friend of the organization, and a champ on so many fronts. Thank you for being with us today. Take it away, Commissioner.
Thank you. I'm Adams County Commissioner Eva Henry, and I've been a local elected for almost 17 years. I'm very familiar with the land use concerns in the metro area and in the state area. I also sit on the Maker Housing Authority Board and on the Regional Air Quality Committee. The housing crisis is connected to the broader climate and air quality crisis along the Front Range. Without building more housing that is truly affordable for different income levels, and that is near convenient transit or close to where people live, work, and play, we are going to continue to see people priced out to a further sprawling development and locking in a future with countless Coloradoans dependent on cars to get everywhere they need to go. Local governments and the state governments, they need to collaborate to implement effective housing policies and initiatives that meet our collective goals and don't place the burden of solutions on one municipality or county. Adams County cannot solve the housing affordability crisis and the climate crisis alone. We need to all work together to tackle these generational challenges. You know, I've talked to a lot of residents who drive a long ways to their jobs out of Adams County, because Adams County is the most affordable county in the metro area. And I had talked to one or a couple of residents. One resident had been a mechanic for 27 years, and he has commuted for 27 years from Thornton to Boulder every day. He makes $32 an hour and could never find an affordable place to live in Boulder. Another resident works for a credit union in Aurora, and she drives from 84th Avenue and I-25 all the way to 270 and Alameda. It takes her an hour to commute, and she has a very undependable vehicle to do that kind of a commute. So it takes an hour. Sometimes it takes longer, which means that she's either going to be late for work, or if it's going to be later in the evening, it means she's going to be late picking up her child from daycare, which then means that her child had been at daycare for 12 hours. Imagine a little child at a daycare center for 12 hours because her mother can't find a place to live closer to where she works. The housing crisis can be a complex, and there is a need for statewide solutions that address the unique challenges for each community. Pollution doesn't know county or city boundaries. If one municipality does the hard work to build more, but the neighboring cities don't, then we aren't making shared progress. Everyone has a role in solving these crises. In this coming year's legislation, we need to pass a housing needs assessment and strategic growth plan. We need to better understand how the housing crisis is playing out across the street and how we need a comprehensive housing need assessment to understand the specific challenges faced by each community. This would help the local governments make a plan for mixed income, transit-oriented housing, taking into consideration the unique needs for each city and county. Goals would include increasing housing supply near jobs and transit, while minimizing displacements, reducing our greenhouse gases, and conserving water and land. Strategic growth objectives will guide state, regional, and local agencies to update plans and make funding decisions that align with housing policies. Things like incentives for water conservation and disincentives for sprawl are really key in order to be able to address the issues that we are dealing with. The solution for the crisis we are facing in housing and in our environment is collaboration between our state and our local governments. The state does not have all the answers, nor does the local governments. However, we come together to find a solution, we will be able to tackle this very complicated issue. And I appreciate being invited to be on this panel.
Commissioner, thanks so much for sharing some of those stories and really putting a human face on this, because that's what it's about. It's about people and how they want to live and the kind of communities they want to live in. So, all right. Thank you, panelists. You can tell we have a wealth of expertise here. If the panelists want to go ahead and turn on their cameras, we're going to do some Q&A. We've got a lot of Q&A. People have been dropping in there. Couple of things I have seen. There is interest in the state housing and climate report that the governor held up, that little booklet. I've been working my way through it. I think there's a lot in there. We will send around a link to that by way of follow-up to this. And then Matt, people are requesting your PowerPoint presentation. So we will work with Sweep to figure out what is most appropriate to get Matt's terrific information out to folks. Thank you, Matt, for being willing to share the key stuff from that. So that's terrific. All right, we're going to open it up to a few questions. Jazz has been diligently going through them and trying to group some of the most common themes together. So we'll start. I have two here to start. First one, how does alternative housing fit into these issues? So things like tiny home communities, using abandoned shopping malls or underutilized office buildings. How should we think about alternative housing and this issue? Maybe Jonathan, if you want to kick that off, and then I imagine the commissioner might want to weigh in too.
Certainly. So for tiny home communities, it's an extremely efficient per unit or per household sort of fix. It attempts to house people who otherwise wouldn't be housed. So that's good. It's a relatively inefficient use of people helped per unit of land, if that makes sense. So it kind of depends on where you are in the state. If you're in a relatively in a more rural area, then it can be extremely efficient. But a tiny home community in downtown Denver, I mean, maybe it would be better, more efficiently slated for an apartment, building size, hundreds of people or 100 people helped, right? If that makes sense. So the efficiency kind of depends on the density, but it's definitely part of the solution, and can be an extremely efficient, relatively cheap way of addressing these housing needs. Was the second part of the question? What was that on?
Anything you want to add, Jonathan, about office building conversions or underutilized retail space, abandoned shopping malls? Anything about how you all think about that as an opportunity or not?
I think it's definitely an opportunity. There's a number of initiatives that the questioner probably aware of, and others are aware of. They're happening in Denver and in other places to repurpose commercial properties. It's quite an opportunity in the sense that we all know that brick and mortar commercial properties have sort of declined in their occupancy over COVID, and so there's just a lot of building space that is not going to be used in the foreseeable future at the rates that it used to be used as. It can be expensive to convert commercial properties into housing. It's, they're not set up as homes, right? So there's funding and some other sort of things that need to be associated with those initiatives to convert them into livable units, obviously. But it's definitely something that a lot of folks are looking at. That's important.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for being brief so we can get through as many as possible. I appreciate it. Commissioner, do you want to add anything, or should we go to the next question?
Yes, and yes. Adams County actually donated a building that we decommissioned to the Housing Authority, and it used to be an old child welfare building, and it's been converted into 170 units. Some of those units are dedicated to children who are aging out of foster care. RTD has a lot of land for infill. They have a lot of buildings that they also could be donating, along with the state. The state government could also be doing the same. So yes, and yes.
Thanks, Commissioner. All right, I think I'll turn to Matt for this next one. Matt, we have a few folks asking about just a little bit more on the connection between housing density and water use.
Yes, I'm definitely not the expert in that area. I did pull some data from Denver. There are a few studies, though, that look at sort of like the Berkeley neighborhood, for example. And again, the highest water use in residential neighborhoods is on outdoor irrigation. So if we simply did things by just legalizing attached housing types, ADUs, kind of like gentle density of multiplexes, and building homes, you might sort of decrease the size of lawns and turfs that we're using a lot of water for. And at this one study from Berkeley found that you could lower residential water usage by about a third just by legalizing those middle housing types. So that's the first study that sort of comes to mind there. But I'm happy to share some other resources I have in my notes for those who are interested in that specific question.
All right, thanks. So folks who want to talk water and more on that, reach out to Matt. Okay. How do these issues affect the West Slope and rural communities in our state? Jonathan, you started to talk about that a little bit, but I'm not sure who best to maybe highlight some of the rural issues we're seeing here. It's not just a Front Range problem. This is happening all across Colorado. Anybody want to add to that?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the Western Slope in particular is, the most vulnerable for these climate, sort of disasters and issues. So the most to gain from us being part of the solution to address climate change. I was just thinking about Glenwood Springs recently. I mean, the fires that have been visited on the Front Range are terrible, and people on the western side of the state have been experiencing this for a very long time. The Grizzly Fire, right, through the canyon was like the second of those big fires along the canyon. So there was a South Canyon fire too. So Glenwood Springs, just as an example, has now had the forest on both sides of it along the river completely burned. So the impacts are fairly clearly the worst in our higher, more alpine and drier parts of the state. They also are most vulnerable to the water scarcity issues, 100%. So that's the nexus there. When it comes to housing, there's also an issue essentially that you have, and any folks living in those areas are familiar with it, where sort of our resort communities or higher cost communities end up having an economic sort of shed or catchment area that includes multiple other communities, but not enough housing to house all the workers that help that city sort of run or help that town run. And so you have folks having to drive further and further and further distances until certain parts of I-70 and 82 and others look like urban commute corridors. And so that's elevated pollution. That's really impacts families in terms of commute times. I used to have a pretty long commute when I lived in Rifle. Going up to Aspen, it was terrible. Anyone who lives in the West already knows the issues with housing and transit, because you all drive forever to get to work. So it is a problem.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate that. All right, we've gotten several questions about transportation and transit. First one, how do we, this coalition, I think, plan to work with RTD to make light rail and frankly buses, for that matter, more reliable? And we don't, need to talk to a lot of folks on this call about decreased frequency, a lack of reliability, needed improvements to the system to make it more user friendly. Matt, what are we all doing about that?
Yeah, I love the question. Yeah, so I think it's no secret that RTD and pretty much every transit agency in the country took a big hit during COVID. There was essentially no ridership in 2020, and they ended up actually cutting service by about 30%, which is in line with what a lot of other transit agencies done. And it's taking a long time to bring that service back. Even now, we're only at about 80% of pre-pandemic service levels. Where we need to be is where most of the buses and trains are coming at least every 15 minutes or more frequently. That's sort of the benchmark for frequent transit service. And right now, only about 20% of RTD's system is delivering that level of service. So in my opinion, we need to increase funding for transit operations and really focus on bus service where we have high population, job density, heavily utilized routes. And I think there's a lot of momentum in that direction now. The state's starting to invest in bus rapid transit corridors on Colfax and Federal Boulevard and Colorado Boulevard. We've got some exciting conversations around Front Range passenger rail, which are fantastic. And I know the legislature is sort of considering potential partnerships with RTD and policies to, again, bring back service and better fund more frequent bus and rail service. But so yeah, it's a critical part of the conversation. I do just want to also say the best thing we can do is just to allow and encourage more housing and jobs around the system we already built, because that'll go a long way in bringing ridership onto the system.
All right, here. I second that, Matt. All right, it is 1 minute till, so I'm going to close us out here with a huge thank you to our panelists. They did a terrific job. My money is on this team to get some real change done, and linking arms with them, I think, is the way to get this across the finish line. So thank you for being such great partners. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to the governor, and most importantly, thank you to all of you who showed up today to learn more about this issue, to be part of the solution, to be a voice for change. We need you. We are not going to get this over the finish line without you. So keep showing up, keep raising your voice, keep being a part of any and all of our organizations. It doesn't happen without you. So thank you so much. We love having everyone online. And onward, let's get this over the finish line and tackle this issue in this upcoming session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Kelly.